In 1905, deep in the Tennessee Valley, a girl was born who would unsettle doctors, humble professors, and leave her neighbors whispering in fear. Clara Mae Hensley was no ordinary child. At just 10, she calculated problems seasoned scholars struggled to solve, spoke of inventions not yet imagined, and predicted storms with eerie accuracy. Was she gifted by God, cursed by fate, or something far stranger? Before we dive into today's tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. The year was 1905, and the Tennessee Valley was a place where time seemed to move at its own slow, stubborn pace. The hills rolled out endlessly, patched with farmland, woods, and winding creeks. Families worked the land with little hope of riches, measuring their lives by harvests, church bells, and the changing of the seasons. Poverty was common, and few ever traveled far from the place they were born. A child born here could expect a life of chores, hard labor, and quiet anonymity, far from the modern advancements reshaping cities just a few hundred miles away. Electricity was only beginning to creep into the larger towns, and railroads stitched parts of the South to the wider nation. But the Tennessee Valley still relied on horses, wagons, and candlelight. The clatter of typewriters in urban offices, the hum of telegraph wires, even the early experiments with automobiles and flying machines, these belonged to a world most valley families would never touch. The gap between rural and urban life was enormous. While the world was rushing toward modernity, the valley clung to older ways. Religion and superstition intertwined to shape daily existence. The church was not just a place of worship, but the center of social order. Ministers preached both salvation and warning. Hard work was godly, and curiosity beyond one's station could be dangerous. Illnesses were as likely to be blamed on curses or bad air as on poor sanitation. When storms destroyed crops, some whispered of God's wrath. In this environment, anything unusual or extraordinary stood out sharply and was often met with suspicion. Education, especially for girls, was considered secondary. Most families saw schooling as useful only until children could read the Bible and manage basic arithmetic. Beyond that, boys were expected to work the land or find trades, while girls were prepared for marriage, childbearing, and domestic duties. A few ambitious families sent their sons to academies or small colleges, but opportunities for daughters were slim. A girl in the valley might learn sewing, scripture, and household management, with little thought that she could contribute to the wider intellectual world. It was in this setting that the Hensley family raised their children. Their small homestead sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by hickory and oak. The house was modest, a clapboard structure with a tin roof that rattled in storms, heated by a wood stove and lit by kerosene lamps. The Hensleys, like their neighbors, knew hardship. Work began before dawn and ended long after dusk, with every family member contributing, hauling water, feeding livestock, tending fields. And yet, into this world of labor and limitation, Clara Mae Hensley was born. To the outside world, there was nothing remarkable about her arrival. She was just another child in a valley where births were celebrated with hymns and prayers, and survival was never guaranteed. Infant mortality was high, diseases common, and futures uncertain. But as Clara grew, the contrast between her environment and her mind would become increasingly impossible to ignore. The Tennessee Valley in 1905 offered little encouragement for brilliance. The one-room schoolhouses scattered across the hills were staffed by underpaid teachers, often young women barely older than their students. Textbooks were worn, sometimes decades out of date, and shared among siblings. Children scratched lessons onto slates, memorized times tables, and read passages aloud from primers that had circulated since their parents' youth. In such a setting, even modest academic success was noteworthy. Yet, Clara's grasp of knowledge went far beyond anything her teachers could measure. The valley itself was steeped in stories. Elders told tales of hidden springs that healed the sick, of ghostly lights seen in the hills, of omens carried in the cry of whippoorwills. Children grew up on these legends, and adults often treated them as half-truths. It was a world where folklore carried nearly as much authority as the scriptures read from the pulpit. Thus, when something extraordinary appeared, when a child displayed knowledge beyond her years, the community had no framework to understand it outside faith or fear. Earliest demonstrations of brilliance occurred against this backdrop of limited resources and narrow expectations. Her family's neighbors measured intelligence in practical terms: the ability to manage crops, repair tools, or memorize verses. But Clara's abilities slipped past those simple categories. She could observe the skies and, without formal training, announce that storms would arrive days before they did. She studied the patterns of birds and seemed to predict shifts in weather with uncanny accuracy. To the farmers around her, who relied on instinct and luck, this felt almost supernatural. Even within her own home, Clara's gifts unsettled those who loved her. Her mother, a deeply religious woman, praised God for blessing her child, but quietly worried what such knowledge might mean. Her father, pragmatic and wary, insisted she keep quiet about her unusual talents, fearing that neighbors would misunderstand. But word has a way of spreading in close-knit communities. Soon the Hensleys were no longer seen simply as a hard-working family. They were the parents of the young girl who knew too much. By 1905, America was a country both fascinated and troubled by the rapid progress of science. The Wright brothers had flown their fragile machine at Kitty Hawk just 2 years before. Albert Einstein had published papers in Europe that would shake the foundations of physics, though few in the Tennessee Valley would have heard his name. But here, in this isolated corner of the South, the arrival of a prodigy seemed more threatening than promising. The world beyond the hills might have welcomed genius. The valley, rooted in tradition and suspicion, would struggle to accept her. Thus, the stage was set. A child of extraordinary intellect, born into a community unable, perhaps unwilling, to nurture her gift. As Clara Mae Hensley began to reveal the full measure of her abilities, the Tennessee Valley would be forced to reckon with a question it had no answer for. What happens when genius blooms in the wrong place at the wrong time? The Hensleys were not remarkable by the standards of their neighbors. They were a family built on work, faith, and survival. Clara's father, John Hensley, was a stern man in his mid-30s when Clara was born. His hands were calloused from years of farming and occasional shifts at the local mill. He believed in discipline, order, and silence more than tenderness. A hard life had left him skeptical of anything he could not hold in his hands or measure in his fields. For John, children were expected to obey, to labor, and to accept their lot without complaint. Her mother, Martha, was a contrast. Where John was stern, Martha was soft-spoken and devout. She carried a quiet strength, shaped by childbirth, prayer, and endless toil. Martha sang hymns as she worked, whispered scripture over her children at night, and taught them to bow their heads before meals. She was the moral compass of the home, but she, too, knew that in their corner of Tennessee, survival left little room for dreams. Clara was the middle child of 5. 2 older brothers, Samuel and Henry, worked beside their father from a young age. They were strong but restless, often slipping away to hunt or fish rather than complete their chores. Her younger sisters, Ruth and Mary, followed their mother closely, learning cooking and sewing even before they could read. The Hensley children fit neatly into the patterns expected of them, all except Clara. From her earliest years, Clara revealed a mind that moved faster than those around her. By age 4, she startled her mother by reciting entire verses from the family Bible after hearing them only once. At 5, she corrected her father's arithmetic when he calculated the seed needed for a new field. At 6, she shocked her schoolteacher by completing a slate of problems meant for older students, explaining her reasoning with a calm precision unusual for a child. The story spread quickly in a community where gossip traveled faster than the mail. A neighbor recalled that Clara once looked up at a darkening sky and told him the storm would arrive after the hen's roost. Hours later, rain hammered the valley. Another neighbor swore she could measure the yield of his corn crop by glancing at the rows, and when harvest came, her numbers matched almost exactly. These were not simple tricks. Clara's mind seemed wired to see patterns where others saw only chance. She studied clouds, the angle of the sun, the habits of animals. What others felt as instinct, she described as observation. And yet, because her explanations were couched in a child's plain language, many dismissed her as odd rather than brilliant. At school, Clara's talent became impossible to ignore. The valley's one-room schoolhouse served children of all ages, with a single teacher juggling reading lessons for 6-year-olds and history recitations for 15-year-olds. Most students left by the age of 12, destined for fields and farms. But Clara devoured every scrap of knowledge she was given. She finished her reader before the end of her first year, and by her second she was borrowing worn almanacs and arithmetic primers meant for the oldest students. The teacher, Miss Abigail Green, kept a careful eye on her. Abigail was barely 20 herself, fresh from a normal school in Nashville, but even she admitted she could not keep up with Clara's leaps of logic. One afternoon, Clara solved a riddle Miss Green had carried since her own student days, a puzzle in geometry that took her hours as a teenager. Clara finished it in minutes, her small hands smudged with chalk, as she quietly explained the angles to her classmates. Some were amazed, but others grew uneasy. In a community where conformity was prized, a child who outshone not only her peers, but her elders was unsettling. Whispers began. "That Hensley girl is touched," some said. Others muttered that no child should know such things, that it was not natural for a girl to speak with such certainty. Her family wrestled with conflicting emotions. Martha glowed with pride, believing God had blessed her daughter with extraordinary gifts. She encouraged Clara to read, to write, to explore the world with curiosity. John, however, grew more rigid. He feared attention. The valley did not welcome those who stood out, and he warned Clara never to boast of what she could do. When she corrected him in public, he struck her harder than he intended, his shame laced with fear. Despite the tension, Clara's brilliance could not be hidden. She filled scraps of paper with sketches of wheels, pulleys, and strange contraptions no one understood. She traced numbers across the dirt with a stick, leaving neighbors baffled as they passed. At night, by lamplight, she copied long passages of Scripture, not for devotion, but for the joy of memorization and the rhythm of words. Her siblings regarded her with a mixture of awe and distance. Samuel teased her for pretending to be a teacher. Henry avoided her altogether, muttering that she gave him chills. Ruth and Mary, still young, admired her but knew she was different. The bond of childhood play gave way to the separation of someone who no longer fit among them. The most striking moment came when Clara, at only 10, announced during supper that she could see numbers in the sky. She explained that the patterns of stars whispered answers to problems she hadn't even been asked yet. Her parents fell silent, her brothers laughed nervously, and her sisters stared wide-eyed. That night, John prayed aloud that the Lord would not let his daughter stray into dangerous paths. But Clara was not straying. She was advancing, racing ahead of the world around her, and every step only widened the gap between her and the life her family had expected. She was a prodigy, though the valley did not yet have that word for her, and she was beginning to learn what it meant to carry a gift that could not be hidden, even from those who feared it. The early signs of her genius were now undeniable. but they were also a warning. For in a place where tradition reigned and fear of the unknown simmered just beneath the surface, Clara's mind would not be celebrated for long. It would be tested, doubted, and perhaps even punished. The seeds of conflict had been planted, and they would soon grow into something her family could not control. By the time Clara turned 11, her reputation had outgrown the walls of the Hensley farmhouse. What had begun as whispers among neighbors was now a matter of curiosity across the Tennessee Valley. People came not only to trade at the Hensley farm, but to test the girl for themselves, each hoping to catch her in a mistake, each leaving unsettled by what they witnessed. It began innocently enough. A traveling pastor, Reverend Elijah Porter, visited the schoolhouse one spring and heard talk of the Hensley child who could recite scripture backwards and solve riddles faster than grown men. Doubtful, he posed her a challenge before the class. He asked Clara to explain the meaning of a difficult passage from the book of Daniel, one that scholars debated for centuries. Without hesitation, Clara gave an interpretation that blended theology, mathematics, and metaphor in a way that silenced the room. The Reverend, humbled, admitted he had no rebuttal. "The Lord has placed a strange fire in you, child," he said quietly. Word spread. Doctors, teachers, and curious locals arrived at the schoolhouse or the Hensley home with puzzles and questions. Clara answered with a composure far beyond her years. She calculated sums in her head that others scratched out over pages. She sketched mechanical diagrams no one could decipher. When a local physician quizzed her about anatomy, she described organs in startling detail, though she had never seen a medical text. One visiting teacher from Knoxville later wrote in his journal that Clara Mae Hensley possessed a mind that grasped connections between natural and human law, as though she had studied both for decades. And yet she is but a child. That entry, never published, was passed quietly among colleagues, some calling her a genius, others a danger. What disturbed people most was not only her answers, but her predictions. Clara seemed to sense things before they happened. In late summer, she told her father the cornfields would be flooded by the river before the week was out. The sky was clear, the ground dry, and John dismissed her words as nonsense. 3 days later, a sudden storm swelled the riverbanks, drowning half the valley's crops. Neighbors remembered Clara's warning and grew uneasy. The community's unease deepened when she began to describe inventions no one had yet seen. She spoke of carriages that fly without wings, of wires that carry, voices across mountains, and of lightning trapped in glass that would one day power entire cities. These visions unsettled those who heard them. To some, they sounded like prophecy. To others, blasphemy. At home, Clara's notebooks grew dense with numbers, symbols, and strange drawings. Her siblings sometimes found her scratching by lamplight, filling pages with equations and diagrams that looked like maps of the stars or blueprints for machines. When questioned, she shrugged. "It just comes," she said simply, as if such knowledge flowed through her rather than from her. Her parents struggled to make sense of it. Martha prayed, begging God to show her how to guide her gifted daughter. John grew harsher, warning Clara never to speak of flying carriages or lightning in glass before others. He feared ridicule, but more than that, he feared the label of witchcraft. "You'll bring shame to this house," he told her after striking her once for speaking too boldly. Yet even he could not deny the truth of her foresight. When her warnings proved correct, the tension boiled over at the county fair in the fall of 1907. A group of school teachers, skeptical of the tailies, invited Clara to stand before them. They gave her a series of arithmetic problems on the chalkboard, increasing in difficulty. Clara solved them in seconds, her chalk moving swiftly while the crowd murmured. When one teacher challenged her with a riddle in Latin, Clara hesitated only briefly before answering, not with perfect grammar, but with enough clarity to prove she understood the meaning. The crowd gasped, then grew restless. Some applauded. Others muttered. The idea that a young farm girl could outshine educated men embarrassed them. One man spat on the ground, declaring, "It ain't right for a child to know such things." Another crossed himself and walked away. That night, Clara's name became both legend and curse. Some called her a marvel, a prodigy sent by God. Others whispered that no ordinary child could possess such knowledge without darker influence. Parents warned their children not to linger near her, lest they be touched by her strangeness. Invitations to test her genius slowed, replaced by wary glances and avoided paths. But Clara herself did not gloat. She did not boast. She seemed instead burdened, as though her mind raced ahead of a world too slow to follow. She once confided to her mother that her thoughts felt like a river that never stops, and that sometimes the noise of ideas made it hard for her to sleep. Martha wept silently, realizing that the gift which set Clara apart also isolated her beyond comfort. The brilliance that had first drawn admiration now began to sow division. Those who once visited to marvel now avoided the Hensley farm altogether. The family's pew at church grew emptier around them as neighbors chose other benches. Children teased Clara as witch girl or devil child, while adults whispered that the Hensleys must have sinned to be punished. With such a daughter, yet Clara's mind would not be silenced. She continued to write, to calculate, to predict. She seemed caught between two worlds, one rooted in the superstition of her valley, the other reaching toward a future only she could glimpse. And as the gap between them widened, so too did the suspicion that would soon threaten to swallow her entirely. The valley had been given a child of extraordinary intellect, but instead of lifting her up, it turned inward in fear. Clara Mae Hensley had defied every expert who came to test her, but now she faced an adversary far stronger than professors or pastors. The deep, immovable fear of a community that could not comprehend her gift. By 1908, the name Clara Mae Hensley no longer stirred curiosity so much as unease. What had begun as whispers of admiration now turned into whispers of fear, and fear spreads more quickly than wonder ever could. The Hensley family noticed it first in subtle ways. At church, neighbors who once greeted them warmly now kept their distance. Mothers pulled children closer when Clara entered the room. Some would not meet Martha's eyes in the marketplace, as though acknowledging her was dangerous. A few neighbors, emboldened by gossip, said openly that the Hensleys were harboring something unnatural. Religious leaders played no small role in this shift. Reverend Porter, who had once admitted Clara's gifts might be from God, now stood at the pulpit warning that the devil worked not with horns and fire, but with deception and false brilliance. He never named Clara directly, but the congregation needed no names. Eyes flickered toward the Hensleys' pew, and Clara sat still under the weight of their stares not at home. The atmosphere grew tense. John Hensley grew harsher than ever, urging his daughter to keep her silence. "If you must think your thoughts, girl, keep them in your head," he said, his jaw set like iron. But Clara could not cage her mind. Her ideas poured out of her onto scraps of paper, etched into dirt, whispered in quiet moments when she believed no one was listening. Her mother found her one morning, scrawling symbols across the inside of a flour sack with a piece of coal. When asked what it meant, Clara only said, "It's what the river tells me when it rises." The community's suspicion worsened after one particularly grim event. A local boy, Matthew Crow, fell from a hayloft and broke his neck. Days before, Clara had told a classmate that a boy will fall, and he won't get up. When news spread of Matthew's death, Clara's words echoed in the valley like a curse. Though no one accused her directly, whispers turned to accusations. She knew, some said. She saw it before it happened. To a valley bound by Scripture, the ability to see the future was not a gift, it was an abomination. the family began to feel the consequences. John found his neighbors reluctant to lend tools or trade goods. When he tried to sell corn at market, buyers turned away. Some claimed his fields were cursed because of his daughter's presence. "I won't bring that into my house," one man muttered, waving away a perfectly good sack of grain. Clara herself endured cruelty. Children mocked her in the schoolyard, calling her witch child or devil girl. They threw pebbles at her as she walked home, daring her to predict what would happen to them next. One girl crossed herself each time Clara spoke aloud. Miss Green, her teacher, defended her when she could, but even she admitted in private that Clara's mind made her uneasy. "She knows things I don't," Miss Green confessed to Martha one afternoon. "And I am the teacher. That is unnatural." Despite the ridicule, Clara continued her strange work. She filled page after page with diagrams of machines no one had seen. Wheels that turned without horses. Tubes that carried sound. Towers strung with lines she said would one day connect towns like threads on a quilt. When Martha looked at these drawings, she felt pride and dread in equal measure. "Child," she whispered once, "you're dreaming of things that don't exist." Clara only smiled faintly and replied, "Not yet." But it was not only her inventions that frightened people. Clara had an uncanny ability to describe the natural world with an accuracy that no farmer or doctor could match. She diagnosed a neighbor's illness as something in the blood, not the stomach. Weeks before the doctor from town confirmed typhoid fever. She advised another family to dig their well deeper, or the water will sour. And when sickness swept their household later that summer, her words seemed prophetic. These moments, meant as kindness, only deepened suspicion. How can a girl know such things unless she brings the sickness herself? One woman muttered. Her father grew more fearful. Once in anger, he burned a stack of her papers in the stove, declaring that nothing good comes from what folks can't understand. Clara wept quietly as the smoke rose, not from anger, but from sorrow that her mind could never be small enough to fit the world she lived in. Martha tried to comfort her, but even she knew there was little safety left. The breaking point came in the fall of that year, when Clara predicted another flood. Standing on the bank of the river, she told her mother, "The water will rise higher than the church steps." Martha shushed her, but word got out, as it always did. When heavy rain struck days later, and the river swallowed barns and fences, villagers pointed to Clara as though she had willed it herself. "That girl called it down," one man shouted during Sunday service. "She's not of God." The reverend did not stop him. Instead, he spoke of testing spirits, of casting out darkness before it spread. The congregation murmured in uneasy agreement. Fear had taken hold, and once rooted, it would not release. At home, Clara grew quieter, but her silence was not submission. She still wrote in secret, filling hidden notebooks with equations and sketches. She still observed the skies, the plants, the shifting winds. Her brilliance burned as fiercely as ever, but it was no longer met with curiosity. It was met with dread. By the time winter settled on the Tennessee Valley, the Hensleys lived in near isolation. Neighbors passed their home without knocking. Children who once played in the yard stayed away. The family's survival grew more precarious, their social ties frayed beyond repair. And in the middle of it all was Clara, a child burdened by a mind too vast for her place and time, and a community unwilling to see her as anything but a threat. The valley, once her playground of wonder, had turned into a cage. And soon, the pressure of that cage would push Clara and her family to the breaking point. By 1909, Clara Mae Hensley had become the most talked about child in the Tennessee Valley, though never in ways her family wished. Her brilliance, once a marvel whispered with pride, now lingered in every conversation like a curse. And as the seasons turned, the weight of suspicion pressed down harder, until it seemed only a single spark was needed to set the valley aflame. That spark came at the county fair. Every autumn, families from miles around gathered to show livestock, trade crops, and test their skills in contests of wit and strength. The fair was a reprieve from backbreaking farm life, filled with laughter, music, and the smell of roasted corn. That year, however, it became the stage where Clara's gift and the valley's fear collided. In front of hundreds, teachers from neighboring towns had heard of Clara and wanted to expose her as nothing more than a trick of rumor. They brought puzzles, arithmetic problems, and riddles written on chalkboards, certain they would confound her. Clara, thin and pale from sleepless nights of scribbling in her notebooks, stood silently before the crowd. The murmur of voices rose as she picked up a piece of chalk. One by one, she solved their problems. Multiplication that filled entire slates took her seconds. Geometry questions that had stumped older students, she answered with neat diagrams. When asked to explain a Latin phrase, she hesitated only briefly before providing a translation close enough to silence the skeptical. Each answer she gave seemed to drain the color from her challengers' faces while fueling the unease of the audience. What should have been triumph quickly soured. Rather than celebrate her genius, the crowd grew restless. Some clapped half-heartedly, but others muttered darkly. "A girl can't know such things," one farmer spat. "It ain't right." A mother pulled her son close, whispering, "Don't look her in the eye." An old man crossed himself and said she was born of shadows. The Hensleys left the fair humiliated, their daughter's brilliance twisted into a spectacle of shame. That night, John Hensley, usually silent and stern, slammed his fist against the table. "No more," he growled. "You'll bring this family to ruin." Clara sat trembling, not from fear of his anger, but from a growing awareness that no matter what she did, she could not belong. The valley's suspicion turned to outright hostility in the weeks that followed. When livestock fell sick, Clara was blamed. When a barn burned in the distance, someone muttered, "That girl drew it down with her numbers." When an early frost withered fields, whispers claimed Clara had cursed the crops. Fear had become superstition, and superstition needed a scapegoat at school. The bullying intensified. Stones were thrown harder, words sharpened crueler. Children dared each other to touch her books as though they carried disease. Miss Green, once her protector, began to falter. She told Clara gently that it might be best if she stayed home for a while, until things quiet down. But things did not quiet down. Clara withdrew deeper into herself. Nights found her awake, hunched over candlelight, scribbling faster than ever, as if desperate to capture everything flowing through her mind before it was taken from her. Her notebooks grew thicker, filled with diagrams of towers strung with wires, strange flying machines, and numbers that looked like formulas no teacher in the valley could decipher. She muttered to herself about currents that move unseen and machines that will speak without voices. Her mother grew increasingly alarmed. Martha begged her to rest, to stop writing things no one understood. "Child, they'll burn you for this," she whispered one night, tears streaming down her face. But Clara only shook her head and said softly, "It won't matter, Mama. The future is already coming, whether they see it or not." Then came the event that sealed her fate. One cold November morning, Clara told her younger sister Ruth not to play near the well. She said simply, "Something will fall." Hours later, as if conjured by her words, the family's cow broke through the rotted boards and crashed into the well. Though the animal was rescued, word spread like wildfire. Clara had cursed the well. By evening, a group of men stood outside the Hensley home, demanding John do something about his daughter before the valley suffered worse. John drove them off with threats, but the look in their eyes chilled him. He realized they would not remain content with warnings for long. That night, he sat at the table in silence, while Martha prayed aloud, clutching her children. Clara, seated apart, wrote feverishly in her notebook, as though recording the final fragments of a vision, only she could see Dot within weeks. Clara grew ill. Whether from exhaustion, malnutrition, or something darker, no one could say. She stopped eating, her once bright eyes shadowed, her voice faint. Still, she tried to write, her trembling hands scrawling incomplete diagrams across paper. She whispered of a great light that will cover the land, and voices carried through the air like birds. Her mother wept as she tried to soothe her fever, but nothing eased a Dot by the end of winter. Clara was gone. Some said it was illness. Others claimed she simply wasted away under the crushing weight of her gift. The valley, however, told a harsher tale, that the Lord had struck her down for meddling in forbidden knowledge. Neighbors who once watched her with fear now nodded knowingly, as though her death was inevitable. Her notebooks, filled with the strange fruits of her mind, vanished. Some whispered John burned them in the stove, unable to bear the danger they represented. Others claimed Martha hid them in the walls of the farmhouse, unwilling to destroy the last proof of her daughter's brilliance. No one ever saw them again. The breaking point had come and passed. Clara Mae Hensley, the girl who defied every expert, had been broken not by her mind, but by the world around her. A valley too small, too fearful, too bound to superstition, had swallowed her whole. And yet, even in death, her presence lingered. Stories of her predictions, her visions, her strange inventions refused to fade. The Tennessee Valley would never forget the girl genius, not because they celebrated her, but because they feared what she represented. When Clara Mae Hensley's short life ended in the bitter winter of 1909, the Tennessee Valley breathed an uneasy sigh of relief. For some, her passing was a tragedy. For others, it was the long-awaited conclusion to a story that had unsettled them for years. In a place where suspicion often outweighed compassion, the valley's judgment was swift. Clara had been too strange, too brilliant, and too dangerous. Now she was gone, and life could return to its narrow, familiar rhythm. The Hensley household, however, bore the silence of grief like a shroud. Martha moved through her days with eyes hollowed by sorrow. She still hummed hymns as she worked, but the melodies carried no warmth. Her hands, once quick to smooth her daughter's hair, or turn the pages of a Bible for her curious eyes, now trembled as though forever reaching for someone who was no longer there. John grew harder still, his face lined with guilt and exhaustion. Though he never admitted it, neighbors whispered that he carried shame for not protecting Clara better, or perhaps for not silencing her sooner. Dot in the weeks following her death. Rumors spread faster than truth. Some said she had cursed the valley and paid for it with her life. Others claimed the Lord had struck her down to protect the community. A few whispered that she had been poisoned by her own father to save the family from disgrace. No explanation satisfied, but none were silenced. In time, the valley's gossip solidified into a single, unshakable judgment. Clara was a warning, not a gift. The newspapers wrote little about her passing. A brief note appeared in a regional column, identifying her only as a remarkable child from the Tennessee Valley, known locally for unusual talents. Beyond that, she was forgotten by the press, her story deemed too small for national attention, too uncomfortable for scholars to pursue. The world, already racing toward modernity, had no space for a lost prodigy in an obscure valley. Dot, but within the community, Clara's shadow lingered. Children whispered her name as a ghost story, daring one another to look at the old Hensley house after dark. Parents warned their children not to be too curious, not to question too boldly, invoking Clara as a cautionary tale. "Don't end up like that Hensley girl," became a phrase muttered when someone asked too many questions in school. Curiosity, once the spark of Clara's brilliance, was now framed as a dangerous fire. Her notebooks, the last proof of her genius, were gone. Some swore John had thrown them into the stove, the very night she died, watching the strange symbols curl and vanish into ash. Others believed Martha had hidden them, tucking them beneath floorboards or into the hollow of a wall, unable to destroy the fragments of her daughter's mind. A handful of neighbors even claimed that scraps of her papers turned up years later, found in barns or tucked between hymnals, filled with designs for machines no one could interpret. But no verifiable record survived. Clara's work disappeared, and with it, any chance for her brilliance to be studied or understood. For the Valley, this disappearance was not a loss, but a relief. Good riddance. One man was overheard saying, "We don't need her kind here." The church, too, offered quiet judgment. Reverend Porter delivered a sermon not long after her death, speaking vaguely of false lights that can mislead the faithful. He did not name Clara, but everyone knew. From the pulpit, her legacy was sealed not as a child of wonder, but as a cautionary example of pride and dangerous knowledge. And yet, not all voices condemned her. Miss Green, her former teacher, left the Valley within a year of Clara's death, moving to Nashville to pursue further studies. In private letters, she wrote of Clara with awe and regret. "I believe I witnessed a mind like no other," she confessed. "But we crushed it beneath fear." Her words, never published, remained hidden in family trunks for decades, a quiet testimony to the tragedy of a child unrecognized in her time. In the Hensley home, Clara's absence was a wound that never healed. Martha often sat alone on the porch, staring at the hills as though waiting for her daughter to return. Ruth and Mary, her younger sisters, carried memories of Clara like secret treasures, whispering her name in the dark long after others forbade it. Her brothers, Samuel and Henry, hardened into silence, refusing to speak of her at all. The judgment of the Valley had been rendered, but judgment is not the same as truth. Clara's story was not written in books or recorded in academic journals. It was carried instead in whispers, in half-remembered tales, passed down at kitchen tables and firesides. Over time, she became less a person and more a legend, the genius girl who defied every expert and paid the price for it. And in those legends, the tone was always tinged with unease. Some described her as a warning of what happens when one challenges God's order. Others painted her as a ghostly figure, haunting the Valley with visions of futures yet to come. But beneath every telling was the echo of what had been lost. A child whose brilliance could have reshaped lives, silenced by the fear of a community too small to hold her. The Tennessee Valley moved on, as valleys do. Harvests came and went, children grew and left, new families replaced the old. But every so often, when storms gathered or when strange lights flickered in the sky, someone would murmur about Clara Mae Hensley, the girl who knew too much, who saw too far, and who was judged not for her sins, but for her gift. The story of Clara Mae Hensley is not one you'll find in textbooks or scientific journals. It lives instead in whispers, in half-forgotten family tales, and in the uneasy memories of a community that chose fear over understanding. She was a girl born in the wrong time, in the wrong place, a child whose mind reached far beyond the boundaries set for her, and who was punished for it. What makes her story haunting is not only what she achieved in her short life, but what she might have achieved had she been allowed to flourish. In another time, in another place, Clara might have studied alongside the great thinkers of her age. She might have designed machines that carried voices across continents, or predicted storms with precision that saved lives, or uncovered patterns in the stars that changed how we see the universe. But in the Tennessee Valley of 1905, genius was not a gift. It was a threat. Her legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Societies often fear what they cannot explain. Clara was judged not for wrongdoing, but for brilliance. Brilliance that challenged the limits of what her neighbors believed possible. To them, her knowledge was not a blessing, but an intrusion. proof that something beyond their understanding had entered their world. And in their fear, they chose silence over support, suspicion over celebration. Yet even now, her story continues to resonate. In every tale of Clara passed down through generations, there is a mixture of awe and unease. Some call her cursed, others blessed, but all agree she was unlike anyone they had ever known. The fact that her memory has endured, despite the valley's attempts to bury it, is itself a testament to the power of her mind. Legends do not cling to the ordinary. They cling to those who defy explanation. Today, Clara Mae Hensley's life stands as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning of how fear can destroy what it does not understand. An inspiration to those who carry gifts that set them apart, reminding them that brilliance often comes with isolation, but that does not diminish its worth. Her tragedy reminds us that genius cannot be caged forever. It will always find a way to be remembered, even if only in fragments of stories told around kitchen tables. And so we are left with questions that linger like the echo of a hymn. Was Clara truly a prodigy, a child ahead of her time whose brilliance could have rivaled history's greatest minds? Or was she something else entirely, a mystery science still cannot explain? Was she cursed by fate, blessed by God, or simply born into a world too small to hold her? These are the questions that keep Clara's story alive more than a century later. And perhaps they are the questions that matter most, because they remind us that history is not just what is written in books, but also what is whispered in fear, remembered in fragments, and carried forward by those willing to listen. So I ask you now, what do you believe? Was Clara Mae Hensley a genius silenced by ignorance, or a mystery that will never be solved? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another forgotten story of history's mysteries. And share this with someone who believes the past still has secrets worth uncovering, because sometimes the most haunting stories are not the ones written in books, but the ones erased from them.